Hello and welcome to the Barcast. I'm your host, Nick Barr, coming to you in a sunny spring afternoon here in Bratislava, Slovakia. What better place than Slovakia to finish the 27 personalities in search of being? We're on the 27th personality, the self-preservation 3, whose keyword is security. So let's read what Naranjo has to say by way of introduction. When considering any type 3 from a broad perspective, what tends to stand out are its social and sexual manifestations. However, when we encounter self-preservation 3s, we can't exactly say we're facing a third form of vanity. Just as the proud in the self-preservation subtype don't appear particularly prideful, that's the 2, the self-preserving vain don't seem visibly vain either. I've come to describe them as counter-vain, using language analogous to psychoanalysis when it introduced the notion of the counterphobic character, one who hides fear through visibly bold behavior. Over the years, I've come to see that this same dynamic holds true in the self-preservation versions of each passion. In the case of type 1, for instance, it's striking how little they appear angry. They mask their anger while also defending against it through benevolent attitudes. The case of the self-preservation 3, who seems minimally vain, is akin to someone so determined to be a good person, that is, to follow the perfect or ideal model of the good mother, the good homemaker, etc., that living this way results in an implicit taboo against vanity. For this reason, it can be difficult for someone without much experience to recognize a self-preservation 3 who could easily be mistaken for a 1 or show other traits of other types. If we ask what their neurotic need is, what a self-preservation 3 needs above all, it might seem that they're mainly trying to be good. But that's a universal commandment present in the lives of nearly everyone, even if some rebel against it. What's more specific to the self-preservation 3 is the concept of security, a notion emphasized by Ichazo. It seems to me that a threatened sense of security leads these individuals to develop a special form of autonomy. Because they weren't sufficiently cared for, they learned to take care of themselves, and eventually they also come to take care of others. There's an atmosphere of security around self-preservation 3s, and they're often people others turn to for advice, as they seem to specialize in problem solving. However, this passion for security can lead to excessive simplification in their lives, as they reduce their interests to what is most practical and useful. Moreover, when too much emphasis is placed on efficiency, one ends up making efficiency itself efficient. So that's the introduction to the self-preservation 3. A lot to unpack here before we launch into the transformation essay. First of all, it's so interesting that here we are at the very, very conclusion, and Naranjo makes a really interesting point about the self-preservation subtype in general, which is he finds that it generally demonstrates sort of a counter display of the passion. I've seen the counter type used differently in other programs. Like, I think, for instance, the counter type isn't always listed as the self-preservation type. So it's kind of interesting, but I trust Naranjo here. I'm not going to do a full audit on on all the types, but just thinking about it, the 5 might be really interesting to play with, right? The self-preservation 5, wouldn't that be the 5iest, right? Because like the 5 is already very self-preservation oriented. So that's kind of why I at first glance, actually, as much as I'm biased toward agreeing with Naranjo, sorry, I've got all sorts of notifications. So with some subtypes in question here, the self-preservation 5 as an example, I think it is interesting to think about the counter vain type here. And I do think in general with the 2 and the 3, the keywords are not that differentiated. Remember, we have the ambition for social 2, conquest for sexual 2, prestige for social 3. Ambition, conquest, and prestige are all somewhat undifferentiated, just as words for me. Whereas the self-preservation 2, privilege, and the self-preservation 3, security, as we'll talk about, is differentiated. At the same time, the self-preservation 3, security, to me sounds 6-ish. And so we'll explore that as we go. And of course, counterphobic is the most used counter word in the Enneagram to describe the counterphobic 6. Who, now again, paradoxically, if we're following Naranjo, the counterphobic 6 should be the self-preservation 6. That following his own language here. But in fact, the counterphobic 6 is more typically the sexual 6. So interestingly, I don't think Naranjo is to be followed here with this generalization. But that aside, we're talking about the self-preservation 3, security, and we're just remembering we're in my neighborhood. I connect closely with self-preservation 4 energy. And so the self-preservation 3 energy, I'll be curious because security doesn't have that much energy for me, but we shall see. Anything else to say here? I guess the word efficiency, efficiency might be worth holding alongside security. Efficiency is such an important word in the United States, in the tech ecosystem. So let's hold on to efficiency alongside security as we read this, The Transformation of Self-Preservation Type by Assumpta Mateu. She acknowledges several co-authors as she begins. Claudio Naranjo refers to a gesture when speaking about a person's transformation process. As if it were a sign, this something gives us a hint that we are already somewhere else, in another state of consciousness, another attitude, another perceptual dimension of the ego and its workings, and the growing certainty that the machine dominates us less and less. I actually don't know what she means there. Why don't I quickly bring up the original. It's a good translation. I just don't un gesto. I don't know. Let's continue. If the inertia of the self-preservation 3 is based on being seen, on action directed by the gaze of the other, the gesture toward healing lies in looking inward, emphasizing that this gesture must manifest an attitude, not in striving to achieve it. Okay, so the gesture she's talking about here is the gesture of looking inward. From everything we've gathered, what stands out is an evolution towards self-awareness and understanding of the compulsive process and the ability to catch oneself in one's own traps. There's talk of more awakened consciousness, which points to a reduction in self-deception. From this place, the need to sell ourselves to an external image is called into question. So that sort of still feels general 3-ish to me. I notice myself reworking paths, less concerned with my image. This is a quote. When the self-preservation 3 begins to take life as it comes, they begin to rest, lean back, and trust. There is in the self-preservation 3 a pressing need to believe they can handle everything, even at the cost of their own health and self-care. Gradually, that attitude begins to fall away. Age seems to be a determining factor here as physical strength declines. One hopes that wisdom and understanding increase. I stopped being the superwoman of the family and at work. Something I used to be proud of. I ask for help and acknowledge my fatigue and the limitations imposed by age. I'm not afraid of aging, but I still fear dependence, the loss of my intellectual capacity. So, at this point, I can't really tell you whether we're talking about a 3, a 2, right? Because the 2 is the one who wants to handle everything, even at the cost of their own health and self-care. That could also be a 1. It could even be a self-preservation 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, all of these types could be described as, taking too much on and denying their own needs. 4 the least, but the self-preservation 4 certainly. One of the loops we observe in self-preservation vanity is that when one finally realizes they are vain, censorship appears. How can I be vain? Being vain isn't right. It's not virtuous. But if we don't dare to clearly and authentically show our vanity, we are then accused, or worse, we accuse ourselves of false modesty. And we're back at the start again. I show vanity, I mustn't. I show modesty, it turns out to be fake. It's a vicious circle. So I'm kind of browsing here, and I'm looking for the heart of 3-ness and the heart of self-preservation 3-ness. I think, here's a quote. As self-preservation 3, as they progress on the path, gradually dissolves their anxieties. The obsession with security relaxes, and they move more quickly toward relativizing that need, even if they feel physically depleted. It is about surrendering to what is. I feel more secure in myself. There's a security that comes from an internal place, from the sense of being, and hardly at all from external achievements. The greatest shift is letting to go of a purely mechanical cause and effect, materialistic view of life in favor of a more spiritual dimension, where I've been able to recover or discover a sense of devotion to God and an awareness that everything happens, even the most dramatic, fits into a divine plan. Okay, so I think there might be some themes that we can touch on here. Can you tell I'm kind of like done with this project? We're at the home stretch. I just... very, very helpful, but the energy of the self-preservation 3 isn't coming through strongly to me. Part of it, as I've acknowledged, is the 3, the 6, and the 9 in particular trip me up. The 3 and the 6, and the 9 being the core numbers. Sometimes it feels like we're talking about everybody. But the 3 also, being my neighborhood, I maybe have some blind spots there. But let's touch into the 3. What we know about the 3 in general is that there's, like the 5, a sense of internal emptiness. But unlike the 5, there's a blindness to that emptiness. So the 3 isn't aware of what's missing. The 3 is not very introspective. The 3 is pragmatic, practical, mechanical, efficient, etc. So there's a sort of natural shallowness to the 3. And if they even for a second start to kind of challenge that shallowness, they get confronted with this profound emptiness that, for the most part, is like, don't want to go there. And so I think the 3 is... that's true sort of all of the subtypes. This 3, the security 3, the self-preservation 3, what is the image that they are holding on to, right? So the social 3 is the image of social prestige. And so success would be a keyword. Prestige is the keyword. Sexual 3 is the romantic other. So attractiveness or masculinity or femininity. Self-preservation 3, what I hear in this is almost a, we think about the fortress of the 5 or that sort of protective energy, but they're more preoccupied with the image of that. The good father, the good husband, the good protector, the good mother, the good wife, the good whatever they are. the social not social exactly in the social three sense, but they need this internal assurance of goodness. I think assurance could be another part of this keyword. So security, it's not exactly the material security, although that absolutely will be present, but I'm not sure if that's the most prominent. It's the sort of secure self-attachment, secure attachment with one's identity. Do I really think that I'm a good father? Do I really think that I'm a good husband? And I might have a preoccupation with security or assurance in that goodness. Now, how do I attain that? It's not through the assurance of other people, that would be the social three, or the assurance of my partner, that would be the sexual three. It's sort of like almost like an auditing process, an inspector process. I'm auditing myself and determining, am I a good father? Well, these are my pros, these are my cons. And so as a result, there's a profound loss of trust, which I think is so key here. And the three in general, if we're disambiguating the three from the two as an example, or the eight, the three and the eight sometimes can look similar. The three shows their lack of trust through a lack of spontaneity. We've talked about lack of spontaneity before, I think, with the two, but I find the two to be pretty free in their expression. The three, everything is kind of going through this image process. In a way, that's the paradox of the three. The three, in their obsession of efficiency and pragmatic best way forward, is always piping everything through some algorithm of what's the best way forward. So they are kind of machines or mechanical in that sense. And precisely in that pursuit of efficiency, they're the least free. They're the least kind of immediate in their expression. You can feel this with threes. This is why I don't think that I'm a three, although I know that I suffer from a lack of trust, self-trust, certainly am efficient-minded. All that stuff is completely true for me. But there's a certain artistry of expression or freedom of expression that I also have access to that feels more of a home base for me in my fourness, because the four has this artistic expression. However, the four also, none of these types are really free. The four has their own processing algorithm, but that's through the algorithm of aesthetics, aesthetic expression, which I think is like a slightly faster move. I don't know if this makes any sense as I'm talking about it. It makes sense to me internally. It's like there's your being, your true being, and then there's this filter through which, before you express, things have to go through this filter. And all 9 types have some filter. The three's filter is around image. The 2, 3, and the 4 are all image types. It goes through image. And the 3, paradoxically, because they're the most concerned about efficiency and forward progress, is the slowest, I think, of those 3 types. Love is faster. The 2 does things for love. The 4 does things for art and beauty, and that's faster. The 3 has to sort of do this pros and cons, compare and contrast. What will other people say? They're working in spreadsheets, sort of in this pass. That's the outward, the expression, and then the inward is sort of the way they receive. So that's what I take here. Let's keep reading and see to what extent this refutes that or backs that up. They're talking about meditation. I'm just going to skip that over. Avoidance of conflict for someone acting from the gaze of the other becomes intrinsic to their being, their mask. The process of confronting conflict is shaped by the need for everything to be okay for everyone. This trait is so socially accepted that it makes the path to transformation difficult. Some begin to let disagreements take their course, refraining from interfering in the process of things, attempting not to avoid life's darker and more chaotic areas. So that this is where the 3, the 6, and the 9 again, like they really move into each other so much, because we sound like a 9 when we're talking about avoidance of conflict, but the 9 avoids conflict for the sake of potentially belonging, or what is the self-preservation 9s? So we have belonging for the social 9, symbiosis for the for the sexual 9, and for the self-preservation 9. It's something that sounds 8ish. What is it? Appetite. Appetite. Which I think I'll need to revisit. What exactly disambiguates appetite from the self-preservation 8's satisfaction? But it's a slightly, I think, a slightly like tamped down satisfaction is I might want to feast like a lion, and I think appetite is more like, what am I just follow my appetite, basically, kind of like a more animal in its more instinctual, animal instinctual. Anyway, all that is 9 energy, so they're seeking to preserve their ability to get their basic needs met, or survive, or not be expelled by the group by avoiding conflict. But for the, or more precisely, the 9 who feels the separation is always trying to essentially cling to safety by preserving relationship, because somewhere inside of them there's a feeling already of separation. The 3 isn't really as preoccupied by this concept of separation or belonging. What would be scary about conflict would be that my identity as a good, or as an effective, or as an efficient X would be threatened. I'm not a good boss if my employees are fighting. I'm not a good husband if my wife and I are fighting, etc. So more image. Again, image. It always comes back to image for the 2, 3, and 4, the feeling triad. The transformed self-preservation 3 is less afraid of others' anger, more considerate, more respectful of their own needs, allowing themselves to set aside others' needs without guilt. They learn to love themselves well. They begin to allow contact with their own emotions, especially sadness. Their expressive capacity grows while becoming less theatrical. They're more direct, leaving behind detours and manipulation. They become more able to accept and express insecurity, vulnerability, fear, and the need for help. They're less overbearing, more assertive, and less aggressive. It still feels kind of generic. I'm looking for the juice. This is good. In compulsive action from neurotic inertia, the self-preservation 3 loses the reference points of authenticity. In the transformation process, they realize how important it is to learn not to act and to unlearn how they act. This allows for the resurrection of their inner being, their essence. It's not easy, of course. At first, it only happens occasionally, and it's about cultivating the willingness and intention to discover oneself. So 3 is really preoccupied with, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And again, this is why I think they can sometimes look like 8s or 1s in the doing triad, but they're not doers so much as they're preoccupied with doing. What I mean is, like, the 1 and the 8 are both, it's like a lot of 1s are in social work. They might be activists, and they just sort of work their asses off, and you can watch them doing that. But they're not that preoccupied with the image of doing. And so for like a 1, they're almost, remember we were talking about zeal or vehemence of the 1. They're almost like drawn into doing, and then they're almost like in relation to what they've already done. Burnout is common with 1s, right? They can they've been doing, and then they sort of find themselves burned out from how much they're doing, or there might be arguments that come out of their doing, and now they're dealing with like a situation. So the 3 has this compulsive action, but the 3's action again returns to image of like, if I don't do something, then I'm not a good X. It's a lot sort of like more convoluted than the doing of a 1 or an 8. And it's not authentic doing. All doing is passed through what a good X would do. So for the 3, not doing is a really like great transformation nudge, which I think would be true for a lot of the types. But for, let's say, like a 1, not doing would be hard because their whole body wants them to be doing something, and there's a restlessness. Remember, the anger. So if a 1 is not doing, they're going to feel the anger and the frustration. If a 3 is not doing, they're going to feel worthless. They're going to feel very like existentially threatened. If an 8 is not doing, they're going to maybe feel weak, which is terrifying, which enrages them. If a 2 is not doing, if a 2 stops doing, it's close to a 3, but it has more to do with love. Both feeling that they're not loving other people, and so that's existentially scary, and also that they won't be loved. They might be forgotten, hated. Not sure which is worse for a 2, to be hated or forgotten. But for a 3, it's the most directly existentially terrifying, I think, not to do. It's like the shark that, if it stops swimming, dies. Because for the 3, right, I am what I do. At their core, performance replaces being. Quote, any situation that got out of my control left me scared, lost, confused. These situations included events where I lacked the right response. I would then feel a sense of injustice, misunderstanding, or even being lost. This could escalate to the point of freezing, doing the opposite of my normal action-oriented mode. After freezing, I would cry like a child, a hysterical reaction that melted the ice. I needed the tears to feel myself, to breathe, and to reconnect with myself. Today, with a more grounded presence, the disorientation is softened. I can breathe and calm the anxiety by grounding myself and becoming aware of what's happening. I'm less invasive now and a bit more intimate. That's the paradox of the self-preservation 3. I can now see with a different quality of seeing, a gaze that recognizes the other from their unique distant point. Self-preservation 3 fears allowing themselves to feel emotions and feelings, to lose independence, to need help. That feels like more of a paradox for the 3s. Self-preservation 3 is afraid of losing independence, aka autonomy, but is super dependent on the image that is co-maintained between themselves and their relationships. I used to think love was about pleasing the other's needs, meeting their expectations, doing what they needed. I thought love was doing. I never thought it could just be feeling. I realized I had a huge difficulty giving and receiving. I was afraid of being in someone else's hands. So that's interesting. I think the 2 is much more in relationship with giving. Now, whether it's real giving or not, that's its own conversation. But the 2 feels like a giver. The 3 feels like a doer. The 2 feels a sense of generosity. I think that's false generosity, but they feel it. I don't think a 3 would feel generous. but they would feel like they're of service. In the self-preservation subtype, maternal love tends to dominate as a channel for expressing love through being useful to others. For someone of this subtype, there's a compulsion to ensure conditions of safety and stability that give the needed sense of control over their life. Kind of the codependent subtype, is how it sounds to me if described here. So how would that be different than the 6? Maybe I need to stay away from the word codependent because the attachment has it's so overloaded with conversation. The 3 would certainly be less explicitly in need of reassurance than the 6 would, especially self-preservation 6. It seems like the safety and stability and security we're talking about here is not so much about the relational attachment, although that's part of it, but the situational security. We're doing great. We go to Disney World once a year. We're doing great. We visit the in-laws once a year. We're doing great. We're making good money. We're doing great. We have the conventional sense of security. The need for affection is, but again, it's so tricky because the 6 and the 9 all appeal to that. But you can talk to I've talked to a 9 who, when we talk about their need for security or financial security, it comes down to like animal safety, like wouldn't want to be on the street. The 3, it comes down to image. So it's just never enough to, hang out at the surface of like 3s want security, financial security. That's never where the energy is of the type. So we were talking about maternal love, the security and safety and so on. The need for affection is expressed in constant care for others and in avoiding conflict or inappropriate situations. Adaptation becomes so intense, think about the 9, that they forget their own feelings. Now really think about the 9 in favor of a loving ideal. That's the 3 part, in favor of a loving ideal. This attitude, though self-generated in childhood in relation to parental figures, reaches its peak tension in romantic relationships. By contrast, admiring love, that's paternal love in the Naranjo framework, never fully encompasses their existential core. It doesn't occupy much space within the individual. Thus, a self-preservation 3 feels admiration only for certain people, those who are very obviously worthy of it, such as spiritual teachers, scientists, or influential figures in domains important to them. I also hear then social 5 there, totem. So disambiguate that. Erotic love tends to be the least developed or most dormant at the conscious level. It's a child love, paternal, maternal, erotic, or child. Tends to be the least developed or most dormant at the conscious level. Somehow their compulsion to act, to always be in doing mode, interferes with their openness to pleasure. I kind of described why. It's not uncommon then for this type, when they do feel admiring love for one of these figures, to devote themselves to the work or cause that person represents, neglecting pleasure in everyday life. How does a self-preservation 3 experience love? Generally, they expect to receive admiring love in all areas of life, while giving little admiration to others. How can they give admiring love if they're the ones who are supposed to be admired? The love stuff, the paternal, maternal, erotic doesn't have so much strength in my, like the way I conceive of the Enneagram, but I think I understand what's being said here. it's hard for them to access admiration because they're so preoccupied with needing admiration. And they reserve admiration for the most sort of admirable people, because if they throw themselves into devotion to a great spiritual teacher, they kind of get some of that rubbed off on them, I think. Oh, you're working with that person? Well, then you now are worthy of admiration too. I can certainly relate to that. If I didn't have any admirable people in my orbit, what would that say about my own admirability? And the answer to that is just not being preoccupied with admiration. That's why I struggle with these love words, because like admiration feels fraught. And so I have trouble disambiguating when we're talking about sort of some pure devotion, devotional energy, healthy admiration versus unhealthy admiration of kind of wanting to be associated with, sort of basically celebrity. You could use unhealthy admiration of celebrity. From their partner, they expect to receive all three types of love. The romantic relationship is the most important sphere for them. The partner is everything for many self-preservation threes, especially for those who are sexual subtypes. I don't know what's exactly being described there. Social self-preservation 3. That's combining subtypes there. Usefulness. Usefulness is core. Erotic love is camouflaged in being useful to the other. If I'm useful, the other will give me what I need out of obligation. I don't understand a love based on mutual sharing, a love without a price. That's why instinctual and pleasure-based love seems meaningless to me, says Amor. And I think, what is the opposite? When you're not useful, what happens to you? You're discarded. And I think being discarded, the fear of being discarded, is very, very palpable to a 3. I think if you're working with 3 energy, play with the feeling of being discarded. And it's a very, very unpleasant, icky, sticky feeling of being thrown away. It reinforces and shines a light on the deep feeling of being an object. The greatest fear of a 3 is being thrown away. Almost not so much because it will result in abandonment, which might be a 2 concern, or rejection, which might be a 4 concern, but that by being thrown away, it confirms that I was an object all along, and therefore invalidates my whole life, all of my accomplishments, because I have a toaster oven that I'm about to throw away. So how great could that toaster oven ever have been if its fate is to be thrown into the trash? So there's that shame. Shame becomes really, I think, present there. And that's so difficult, so painful to touch. Most of all for the 3 who's got some work to do to get there. The 4 is like, 4 lives there for the most part. I mean, it's hard for everybody, but the 3 has the most work to do in this self-awareness journey. Of the 3 types, 2, 3, and 4 I'm talking about. And I'm going here, for my own benefit. So if 3s out there are feeling picked on, I'm here with you. Accepting my insecurity is one of the most important achievements. Meditation retreats. 3s Threes benefit from meditation retreats, clearly. Crisis is often an essential gateway into awareness. Entering the therapeutic process is very hard. You don't naturally feel drawn to dive into issues, because you basically live your life without a sense of having important issues to solve. That's interesting. Important problems to solve. Threes don't take the inner work seriously until they have to. That's another good way for me to land more clearly in fourness than in threeness. But again, the three quality of me in my inner work is absolutely efficiency and progress, 100%. So security becomes an inner security. I'm less affected by things I don't like. I observe them, but I get less angry. Now I'm much more honest with myself and with others. Compulsion with image, with being liked, with achieving, these are things that disappear. Falseness, false maternal love, control, disconnection from instinct. A fundamental achievement in my inner process has been reconnecting with my instinct, even though it was buried after so many years of control. Seeing and accepting my instinctive side has also meant accepting my most human side, linked to my more earthly self. It has meant recovering physical strength and, in some respects, even health. I'd love to see more on recovering instinct. It comes up time and again with the Enneagram, and I think for the 3, the 4, the 2 in particular, I think recovering instinct is powerful, but we don't see much in this about how, practical ways to do that. I know theater comes up a lot, and embodiment and physical practices. Therapeutic recommendations. Again, whenever we talk about therapeutic recommendations, this is sort of therapists giving guidance to other therapists about working with the 3. The therapist must pay close attention to the condescension of the self-preservation 3 patient and their everything's fine attitude, as this subtype tends to take on the role of the good patient, enhancing the therapeutic alliance. Got to continually guide them back to themselves, to work on their experiences, work on their expectations, and the idealized image of the perfect patient they strive to become in order to be accepted. Very skilled in manipulation, they will play on the therapist's narcissism. If they're the best patient, the therapist must be the best therapist. That's important. Beyond just therapists, right? Like, in our relationship, if I'm doing great, then that means you're great at what you're doing. That only it sort of feels like a virtuous circle. Their greatest difficulty is letting go and showing emotions, especially sadness through tears, as they experience this as a dangerous weakness. I'm just going to kind of move on here. So what must a self-preservation type 3 come to understand? These are bullet points, wonderfully 3-like in our conclusion. Attention must be directed inward, not outward. One exists independently of others. One exists independently of any environment that provides something. Security, acceptance, validation. See how much of true independence is coming out of here. When the self-preservation 3 will present as independent and probably identify as independent, they're very far away from true independence. What matters is the present and its cultivation. One must not project, but rather feel and remain attentive. One is not more or less important than others. Happiness comes from giving, not compulsively, but from genuine feeling, and that happiness comes from receiving, rather than compulsively feeling the need to give back. Okay, so with that, we are done. This was a really enriching project that I am glad to be at the conclusion of. I'll be publishing the document on my website, so you can check that out. And yeah, if you followed along, I'd love to hear from you. I know this was kind of a strange way to be using the platform, but I got a lot out of it, and I hope some people did too. Okay, see you next time.